In this video, I am going to explain about the access control process. As described in the previous video, the access control process governs the granting, preventing, or revoking of access to a resource. The core of an access control process is the establishment of an access control policy or rule that determines which type of access to assign and when. To determine an access control policy, the policy owner needs an evaluation of the asset or data. That is, the owner needs to understand the importance of an organization's assets so that adequate controls can be established. Then the asset should be properly marked so that its classification is clear to everyone, and a disposal policy needs to be established for a time when the access is not needed anymore. The following list highlights the key terminology related to the access control process. First, asset or data classification. This is the process of classifying data based on the risk for the organization related to a breach on the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of the data. The next key terminology related to the access control process is asset marking, and it is the process of marking or labeling assets or data so that its classification is clear to the user. The next key terminology is the access policy definition. Actually, it is the process of defining policies and rules to govern access to an asset. And finally, the data disposal. This is the process of disposing or eliminating an asset or data. Actually, we can say the key terminology related to the access control process are: first, asset or data classification; second, asset marking; third, access policy definition; and finally, data disposal. Alright, now let me to explain a little more about the asset classification. To protect an asset, an organization first needs to understand how important that asset is. For example, the unauthorized disclosure of the source code of a product might be more impactful on an organization than the disclosure of a public configuration guide. The first step in implementing an access control process is to classify assets or data based on the potential damage or a breach to the confidentiality, integrity, or availability of that asset or data could cause. This process is called asset or data classification, and there are several ways to classify assets. For example, military and governmental organizations commonly use the following classification definitions: top secret, secret, confidential, and unclassified. About the top secret, it means unauthorized access to top secret information would cause grave damage to national security. About the secret, unauthorized access to secret information would cause severe damage to national security. About the confidential, it means unauthorized access to confidential information would cause damage to national security. And about unclassified, unauthorized access to unclassified information would cause no damage to national security. The commercial sector has more variety in the way data classification is done, more specifically to the label used in the classification. Here are some commonly used classification labels in the commercial sector: confidential or proprietary, private, sensitive, or public. Let me to explain first about the confidential or proprietary. This means unauthorized access to confidential or proprietary information could cause grave damage to the organization. Example of information or assets that could receive this type of classification include source code and trade secrets. About the private means unauthorized access to private information could cause severe damage to the organization. Example of information or assets that could receive this type of classification are human resource information, for example, employee salaries, medical records, and so on. About the sensitive classification, it means unauthorized access to sensitive information could cause some damage to the organization. Example of information or assets that could receive this type of classification are internal team email, financial information, and so on. And finally, above the public classification means unauthorized access to public information does not cause any significant damage. Although the classification schema will differ from one company to another, it is important that all departments within a company use the schema consistently. For each label, there should be a clear definition of when that label should be applied and what damage would be caused by unauthorized access. Because the classification of data may also be related to specific times or other contextual factors, the asset classification process should include information on how to change data classification. This table summarizes the typical classification schemas for the two types of organization discussed in this video. For example, about the military or government classification, we have top secret, secret, confidential, and unclassified. About the commercial classification, we have confidential, private, sensitive, and public. And finally, about the damage degree of top secret or confidential, we have grave damage. About the damage degree of secret and private, we have severe damage. About the damage degree of confidential and sensitive, we have again damage. And after that, about the damage degree of the unclassified or public, we have non-significant damage. Alright, now let me to explain a little more about the asset marking. Once an asset has been classified with a specific category, a mark or label needs to be applied to the asset itself so that the classification level is clear to the user accessing the asset. Putting a stamp on a document with the label, for example, top secret, and watermarking a digital document with the label confidential are examples of the marking process. Each asset should have a unique identifier. The most significant number is the device or program name. Although you may assume that the name is obvious, you will often find that different users, departments, and audiences refer to the same information, system, or device differently. Best practices dictate that the organization chooses a naming convention for its assets and apply the standard consistently. The naming convention may include the location, vendor, instance, and data of service. For example, a Microsoft Exchange server located in New York City and connected to the internet may be named as MS_EX means Microsoft Exchange, NYC means New York, _1, okay, the location 1, for example. And a SQL database containing inventory records of women's shoes might be named SQL_shoes_W. The name should also be clearly labeled physically on the device. The key is to be consistent so that the names themselves becomes pieces of information. This is, however, a double-edged sword. We risk exposing asset information to the public if our devices are accessible or advertise them in any way. We need to protect this information consistent with all other valuable information assets. An asset description should indicate what the asset is used for. For example, devices may be identified as computers, connectivity, or infrastructure. Categories can and should be subdivided. Computers can be broken down into domain controllers, application servers, database servers, web servers, proxy servers, workstations, laptops, tablets, smartphones, and smart devices. Connectivity equipment might include the IDS, IPSS, firewall, routers, satellites, and switches. Infrastructure might include HVAC, utility, and physical security equipment. For hardware devices, the manufacturer name, model number, part number, serial number, and host name or alias can be recorded. The physical and logical addresses should also be documented. The physical address refers to the geographic location of the device itself or the device that houses the information. Software should be recorded by publisher or developer, version number, revision, the department or business that purchased or paid for the asset number, and if applicable, patch level. Software vendors often assign a serial number or software key, which should be included in the record. Last but not least, the controlling entity should be recorded. The controlling entity is the department or business that purchased or paid for the asset and or is responsible for the ongoing maintenance and upkeep expense. The controlling entity's capital expenditures and expenses are reflected in its budgets, balance sheets, and profit and loss statements. There are many tools in the market that can accelerate and automate asset inventory. Some of these tools and solutions can be cloud-based or installed on-premise. Asset management software and solutions help you monitor the complete asset life cycle from procurement to disposal. Some of these solutions support the automated discovery and management of all hardware and software inventory deployed in your network. Some also allow you to categorize and group your assets so that you can understand the context easily. These asset management solutions can also help you keep track of all your software assets and licenses so you can remain compliant. The following are a few examples of asset management solutions: ServiceNow, SolarWinds Web Help Desk, InvGate Assets, and also Manage Engine Asset Explorer. Alright, about the access control policy, actually the next step of an access control process is to establish the access control policy for each asset or data. This is based on the label the asset received in the classification and marking steps described in the preceding section. The access control policy should include information on who can access the asset or data, when, and in which mode. The access control policy also describes how the access should be protected depending on its state, which could be any of the following: data at rest, data in motion, data in use. About the data at rest, this refers to data that resides in a storage device such as a hard drive, CD or DVD, or magnetic drive. Data is in this state most of its lifetime. Data at rest is usually protected by using strong access controls and encryption. About the data in motion, this refers to data moving between two parties, meaning it is in transit. When in this state, the data is subject to higher risk because it goes outside of the security perimeter where the data owner might not have control. End-to-end encryption and VPN technologies are usually used to protect data in motion. And finally, data in use. This refers to data being processed by applications or programs and stored in a temporary or volatile memory such as random access memory RAM or a CPU register, and also so on. Alright, now let me to explain a little about the data disposal. An access control process should include information on how to dispose of an asset or data when it is not needed anymore, as defined by the organization's data retention policy. Data disposal may take several steps and use different technology. In fact, having a strong process for disposing data is equally important as setting up a process to protect the data when still in use. For example, one type of technique malicious actors use is called dumpster diving. In simple terms, dumpster divers try to find useful information for an attack by looking in the trash, hoping to find useful documents, network diagrams, and even passwords to access systems. Depending on the classification level, data may be subject to sanitization before it can be disposed. Sanitization methods include the following: clearing, purging, destroying. Clearing means this technique should ensure protection against simple and non-invasive data recovery techniques. Purging means this technique should ensure protection against recovery attempts using state-of-the-art laboratory techniques. And about the destroying, this technique should ensure protection against recovery attempts using state-of-the-art laboratory techniques and should also make the storage media unusable.